I have a quick question to start. How many people does that sound like fun? Genuinely. Who here, given the option, would prefer to do software maintenance instead of doing a new feature? 2 people. That's about normal. Yeah. So we're going to dive into people that I call Menders. Incredibly important part of building software, often misunderstood, often put on the wrong projects. And so that's what we're going to dive in today. And so one of the people who way in the back is my business partner, Scott. Hi, Scott. And so yeah, he raised his hand loud and proud. And Scott and I went to high school together. And Scott was kind of your stereotypical computer science person who grew up in the 1980s. He was always in the computer lab, president of the computer club. I was very different. I got my degree in marketing and business law. The way Scott describes it is that I didn't have a seat in the lunchroom, I had a circuit. So very extroverted, I enjoyed meeting everyone, and I've been an entrepreneur since I was 12. I've had several different businesses, just my family has all sorts of businesses. So at the high school reunion, Scott came up to me and said, I have this awesome product, I spent a lot of time on the code is beautiful, and kept talking about how great the craftsmanship was, and talked about people like Uncle Bob and how motivated he was. And I was like, that's awesome, what's the product? And it was something that wouldn't sell. There was no product market fit. And he said, this is what I want your help with. I'm really good at building software, but I really need help with the business side of things. So he offered me 51% of the company if I would come on board and be his CEO. 3 years later, we ended up getting married. So my joke is that I'll give you 51% was the best pickup line ever. So yeah. So it took us a few years to really get on our feet and kind of figure things out. But one day I was like, Scott, we need to differentiate ourselves from every other software consulting company out there. And so we were watching an episode of This Old House, and it was something, I think it was in Boston actually, and they were putting a lot of craftsmanship into a house that had been built in the 1700s. And there was a lot of preservation and a lot of attention to detail. And Scott goes, that. I said, what? He goes, I want to do that to software. I want to take software that still has a lot of value, and I want to make it better. And he goes, my dream job is cleaning up other people's code. And I said, okay. So the marketing person in me goes, there's a lot of legacy code out there, and there's not a lot of people who like doing this. We have product market fit, so we can build a business based on this. So the first thing that I did was I asked Scott, I said, well, what was your favorite project that you've ever worked on? Like, to you, what is the idea of a good kind of software remodeling project feel like? And so he talked about his first project kind of professionally, and he worked on the X-31 jet fighter and wrote the test validation software for it. So he wrote the scripts to make sure that the airplane was safe to fly. And it was an upgrade, so basically the aircraft was built in the 1980s. The hardware that was supporting it, any kind of modern hardware was making it crash. And obviously you need the test scripts to verify that things are safe to fly. So it was a very safety critical system. And testing was a huge part of it. And Scott was like, it was just so complex. There were so many constraints, and it was just an engineer's dream because everybody said we couldn't do it, and yet we did. So they were able to successfully upgrade everything, and we're actually traveling to Germany over the summer to go see it in Munich. So when I started looking at this and kind of the trend of this, I was like, well, that's kind of an esoteric problem. Let me think about when this would actually need to be used. And if we look at the number of apps that have been coming out lately, so this is Apple from 2008 to 2016. And so you can see, like right now, there's 2 million apps in the App Store. Amazon, it's right at 500,000. I think it's 600,000. And then Android, they're right at 2.5. So there's, and just, it's that hockey stick growth. So we as a culture have been really focused on making, right? So there's Make Magazine, there's hackathons, there's maker fairs, there's startup everything. It's get your idea out of your head, hack it, build a business from it, put it in the App Store, and you're good. But my question is, what happens after you launch it? And this is where the demand is coming from. So why do you need to maintain and update these applications? Why is it not enough just to launch it and then be like, we're good to go? First is it's important because when you maintain and update, you can build features faster. So there's this concept of technical debt, which basically think of it as, you know, kind of the cleaning up that you have to do, right? So if I have a big party at my house, right, like that's the equivalent of pushing out a new feature. And if I don't clean up from that, it's gonna be harder to throw the next party until eventually no one's gonna wanna come over to my house because it stinks, right? Like if you haven't taken the trash out in 2 years, no one's gonna wanna come. And that's exactly what happens with our code bases. They start out very fresh and clean, they're greenfield, people wanna work on them, but if you don't clean up and modernize and maintain these systems as you go along, then it's gonna be harder to attract top talent, and you're not gonna be able to generate the revenue because you're not gonna be able to push features out as quickly because your code base is less efficient. Next is that maintaining helps reduce costs. So this is an operations issue. So in businesses, there's a lot of manual processes that go on that software can do a great job automating, right? But we see lots of folks who are still doing manual deployments, sometimes that take days, right? And so we can do that in an automatic way, and then you can take that time and you can put it back into feature development, or you can put it into more strategic thinking. Let the computers do what computers are good at, let the humans do what humans are good at. You can reduce your operational costs, and that can be a competitive advantage. And last is it's a great way to manage risk, all right? So the CIA report came out, big link. Guess what? If you don't update your software, it's prone to vulnerabilities. It's a huge security risk. What we recommend and kind of the industry standard is no more than 2 versions back. And that applies to languages, frameworks, updates, like all of those things. So making sure that your software is in line with the current standards is gonna help you prevent things like mass SQL injections, right? And then somebody comes in, your whole system goes out simply because you didn't update your system. So software maintenance is a huge industry. It's hard to articulate just how much existing software is out there. So IT infrastructure is a $4 trillion industry, trillion with a T. Our federal government, 90% of its IT budget is spent on legacy systems. But yet, they're not doing it in an efficient way, so we're not getting the results, but we're spending all the money. And the finance industry has recognized that legacy systems are a systemic risk. And it almost becomes like the sword of Damocles, which is a Greek myth, and it's, a man who, Damocles, and he's got this sword just kind of hanging over his head, and he never knows when it's gonna drop. That's how a lot of our legacy systems feel these days. One of the things I hear frequently is, it works, so I'm afraid to touch it. So why doesn't maintenance happen? And this is what we're gonna really dive into in today's presentation. So I've identified kind of 4 main reasons. The first is that about 10% of software developers enjoy it, right? So in this room of maybe 50 people, 2 people raised their hands saying that they enjoy software maintenance. But I don't know if you guys noticed, but the 2 people who raised their hands raised them incredibly enthusiastically. They were like, me, please let me do maintenance. So part of this is identifying who genuinely loves doing this work and putting them where they're going to be used best. Next is we've got contract vehicles that simply don't allow it. This is particularly bad in government and in large enterprise. We also have a culture of shame and blame. And we're going to dive into why that makes a big difference. And then finally, executives don't understand the value of software maintenance. And so they just defer it. And I was one of those executives. And so I can speak from experience because I have gone through that journey and can speak and can understand what it's like to be someone who's trying to understand the numbers but having a difficult time. So I'm going to tell you during that section what helped me really understand and really make the case for why software maintenance is a good thing. So first is that 10% of developers don't enjoy it. And I like to think of it this way. It's kind of like what color is your parachute? In this world, it's more like what color is your field? And the way that I think of makers and menders is that makers like taking a greenfield application and turning it brown, and menders like to take a brownfield application and turn it green again. And we've seen that happen a lot of times on our projects where it feels like totally legacy, it feels like a brownfield application, but after 18 months of really good development, doing the agile, it's functioning and it's got a nice security score and it's back up to greenfield status. So it just depends on kind of, are you on the ideation side of things or are you on the maintenance side of things? It's almost like the introvert-extrovert scale. There's not one that's better, but just kind of knowing which projects you like is really, really important, and just even having the words to describe the types of projects you like working on. So let's dive into that a little bit. So makers, this is kind of the stereotypical software developer. It's fast, it's high energy, deadline, 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 sprint, 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 sprint. So the thing that they get the most joy out of is taking an idea and doing the proof of concept. How many people in the room say that's their favorite part? All right, so we've got like I'd say about 15 people. So and if we look at the kind of Pareto principle, which is the 80-20 rule, 80% of the work exists in the last 20% of the project, right? So that 80%, that first 80%, getting a project to 80%, where it's like, yeah, I've got the proof of concept going. Typically what happens, and I tend to be more of a maker, so I'm this way too, is you get kind of shiny objects syndrome, where it's like, okay, that's great, I proved it, I have either done, I fulfilled the need, and so, I'm going to move on to the other project because now I have another idea that I want to prove. And so what ends up, like you see this a lot in the open source space, you just get projects that become abandoned. So finding ways, people who like the making and then menders who can pick it up. Makers tend to be very, very feature focused. So who enjoys building new features? I'll just ask. So about half the room. Taking that idea to MVP, and they're energized by a big launch, right? So they love seeing this kind of idea and all of it accumulate and culminate to this one big day where it either gets released into the App Store or their idea becomes live, or even just writing that to-do list app because they want to learn a new language, or just seeing the joy of the first hello world, right? Menders are a little bit different. So with menders, they really like the idea of problem solving in a slow and steady and calm cadence. So these are the ideal people to put on problems of cleaning up technical debt, right? So I sometimes use the analogy, we talked about having the party at the house, like people who like doing the maintenance, it's like they're the folks who like coming and cleaning up afterwards. So it's like the makers can throw the party, the menders are the ones who are more calm and they're like, I'll just come and clean it all up, so then that way it's beautiful again. Menders also enjoy stability, right? So making a project stable is something that really matters. So once an idea kind of gets to a certain inflection point where then you have the revenue to reinvest back, you want to grow, if you don't start paying down some of that technical debt, you're going to have a really, really tough time building later. Bug fixes, integrations, things that are really challenging, these are the things that stimulate Menders. Big wins through marginal gains. So it's not so much about seeing a big launch, it's more about small incremental improvements over a very long time that then culminates. So this is why I think you see so many Menders who get really excited by the idea of test-driven development, because you're writing a test and just seeing one test pass at a time is something that psychologically you feel like you're making progress. And again, it's about just a slow and steady pace. It's come in, do your thing. The idea of anxiety and adrenaline, it can kind of slow the Menders down and impede their productivity, whereas that type of energy really stimulates the makers. So I mentioned before that you can kind of think about it as like an extrovert-introvert scale. And so again, it's just about putting the right people on the right projects. So if you've got somebody who's a really extrovert, they're a maker, a product owner might be a great role for them because they're going to have to talk to everybody, or sales even, or customer service, or a founding member. Extroverts who are more Menders, Scrum Masters, right? Because again, you're still talking to a lot of people, but you're thinking about how do I make this better over time. Introverts who are makers tend to be more of the feature developers, and Menders who are introverts tend to be really good at DevOps, refactoring, these types of things. And it's not to say that you can't have somebody who's introverted that wouldn't be a great product owner. That's not what I'm saying at all. But just kind of self-identifying and being able to have a framework to describe things can be useful. So one thing that we did about 2 years ago was we said, well, there's got to be other Menders. And we started talking at conferences. And so we said, OK, well, there's 2 or 3 people in each of the talks that we give. What if we got everybody together and put a Slack channel together? So that's what we did. And we put together a podcast and things like this where we talk just about the stuff that Menders like. Now, granted, it's been 2 years. There's only about maybe 200, 300 people in our Slack channel. So it's not exactly going to be a huge numbers. But again, it's the quality of the conversations. It's a very tight-knit group. So if that's the kind of thing that you enjoy, feel free to join at legacycode.rocks. So the next point is that our current contract vehicles, especially in government and enterprise, simply don't allow for this type of work. It's all focused on features. So here's kind of the current procurement environment. We have an outcome that has to be defined up front. And it's a fixed price, and usually it's within a certain scope of time. So you have to know very specifically what you're going to deliver, how much it's going to cost, and when. And this model is built to maximize efficiency. However, because working on the types of problems that existing software systems have, which are incredibly interdependent, it becomes incredibly difficult to estimate. It's kind of like the weather or the stock market. You can predict, you can guess, but because of the number of interdependencies within an existing system, it's going to be impossible to accurately estimate because mathematically it's subject to chaos theory. You can have one variable that is off and then it has a profound impact. So again, it's that butterfly effect. And we see this a lot in legacy systems. And what ends up happening is that we get penalized, we can't make a profit on any fixed price contract. We tried that for a really long time, and it put us out of business because simply we couldn't do it. So we said, fine, we're gonna do it our way and we'll find the right clients. And mid-market companies where I can talk directly to the CEO and they get the value, they get it, and they're like, yeah, we'll create contracts the way that you need it to, but government and large enterprises are really, really struggling to catch up. And if they don't fix this procurement, I have a feeling that a lot of people, their technical debt is going to just simply cripple them, and you'll see a lot of systems starting to kind of implode. So here are a couple of quotes. So this is Sarah Allen, who works at 18F, which is a government agency from the General Services Administration, which is actually designed to help introduce more modernization and more agility into government software projects. And she says, the software is then allowed to grow old until a full rewrite or replacement is needed. And it's precisely this model of maintenance that has created the negative legacy of government software systems that we face today. So what she's describing is what's called O&M, which stands for Operations and Maintenance. And I like to say that O&M is where good developers' careers go to die, right? And which is why no one wants to identify as a mender, because there is a huge risk to your personal career if you say that you like doing this. Because our current procurement model says, well, the features are all that matters. And then once it's done, we're gonna pare everything down into a complete skeleton crew, and there's no innovation. Just keep this on life support. So the people who traditionally are in the O&M group are seen as second-class developers. They're not seen as being as creative or intelligent, which is totally not the case, right? But just that's the way that our system is biased towards makers. So we were like, well, we'll talk to 18F. And we had a conversation with 4 COTARs, so contracting officers, technical representative. And the basic quote was, when we gave them a price for kind of what a typical project costs, because we keep things really lean and agile and we follow XP practices. And the COTAR was really frustrated because he said, you are 1/10 of the cost of other companies. I want to hire you, and I can't because we don't have a contract vehicle that matches the way you work. And so what most businesses do is they feel pressure, and so then they say, well, I need the money and I need government contracts because they're stable. So I'll change my operations so that I can get these secure contracts. And what I said, probably arrogantly, and just also because I don't want the headache of working on projects where I'm not going to deliver good value, is I said, okay, when you find a contract vehicle, come find me and I'll save you 90%, right? And so as developers, we need to start having the courage to say that, this is how we work, and explaining to executives and explaining to CFOs and explaining to people who hold the purse strings why they can save so much money and why it's good for business to follow these models. So this is the procurement that I wish we had. I wish that we had experiment-based procurement that was on a time and materials basis with a ceiling. So for example, we have a hypothesis, like we have a problem, we have a bug, and we know that this is costing us $50,000 a month. So I want to invest 1 month's worth of money to discover what the problem is and see how much progress we make, right? So that is the type of contract that we've seen work really well. Very short term, few weeks, but clearly defining what is the problem, what's your hypothesis, and doing it more as a research and development kind of project rather than an operations and maintenance style project. There's a really good article in First Round Review that I read. Maybe Scott and I had been together 6 years in business, and I know he had been talking about all this agile stuff, and I was still really, really struggling to figure out like what it all meant. And there's this article talked about if you want to really grow your business, let go of efficiency and embrace adaptability. And that to me that was the magic words. Those were the magic words that I needed to hear as a business person to really understand why this stuff matters. Because like I said, our procurement model is built for efficiency. And estimates, efficiency, all of this stuff, the best way that I can describe how embedded this is into business culture is, there's the whole no estimates movement, right? Which I totally buy into philosophically, and yet when I'm confronted and just say, take away estimates, just say that they don't work, that doesn't work for me, because estimates are so deeply embedded into not just my professional education, but also my professional experience. And so it's the equivalent of me saying to you as developers, you know that source control thing? Yeah, it's stupid, just get rid of it, right? It's like, wait, how would you even go about developing if you did that way? And yeah, there are some people out there who really advocate for it, and it's almost like we nitpick over the nuance and over the semantics of it, but we miss the broader picture. So the whole idea is that business people are always going to want to predict, right? That's the entire point of their role, right? And so giving them some sense of what's coming is really important, and using the word estimates is kind of a semantic thing. So I like Tim Ottinger's, and he's here today, but I like Tim's suggestion of moving the no estimates hashtag to being more lean estimates hashtags. So in that way, I think that's kind of more in line with what ours is it's like, yeah, just keep it really small. Like, we don't have to scope out 9 years and like what these deliverables are gonna be, but just what's the next smallest step? And then when you decide that you're not getting value anymore, just stop it, right? And then you haven't bloated up your contract. So the next is a culture of shame and blame. This is a really big one. So how many people can identify with this? So it's who wrote that crap, and then it's get blame says me, oops, right? So you run get blame and it ends up being you. And I think even the idea of get blame, right? Like, this is so embedded, and when you start looking at how we shame people for making mistakes, we shame people for not doing things right, we think, who wrote this, right? That's filled with lots of judgment. But yet that's completely opposite of the prime directive of retrospectives, which is no matter what happened, everyone did their best given the resources that they had at the time. So what we suggest doing is a couple of things. First is alias get blame to something more neutral, like get history, or something positive, like get praise. Because just typing the words get blame puts you in that judgment state of mind, right? And the next is really honing in on being able to listen and understand, and then take multiple perspectives. And evidently this is a buzzword now, but it's the idea of empathy, right? And there are many different types of empathy. There's a really good book called Practical Empathy by Indy Young, where this definition is from, where she outlines 6 different types of empathy. It's not just, like, you can get as technical on empathy as you can on closure, right? So it's understanding what are the technical nuances of some of these things. But really all empathy is, and empathy is the antidote to shame, right? And empathy is feeling like you are able to write down in your pull request comments, or we actually suggest keeping it in the commits messages and using the description field, and saying, what constraints were you under? Like, this is not an ideal solution. I had to get this out in 2 weeks, and if I had more time, these are the 3 things that I would want to improve. So then that way, you're not just documenting how something got done, you're documenting why. And I think we don't document the why often enough, and that rationale really slows us down, because then the person who comes along next, they're gonna have to spend all this time figuring out. So while things are fresh in your mind, take 5 minutes, just type up your thinking, and that can go a really long way. So some of the things that we do at Core Ubites, we have 5 core values, and these have really transformed the way that our culture works. So feel free to kind of share them. So the first is act with empathy. And it's funny because this one, it used to be think of others, because we had like a strategic consultant who has helped us put all this together. And she goes, Andrea, you can't say empathy in software. People won't take you seriously. And so I was like, okay, but empathy really, I think this is really the key to transforming our culture so that people feel included and that we actually make progress on stuff. She's like, I know, but no one's gonna take you seriously, which is, so we had it as think of others for several years, which is one type of empathy, it's the perspective taking. But really, it's deeper than that, right? And yes, I recognize that there are people who are more naturally empathetic than others, but research has shown us that empathy is a skill. The only people who don't have it who are sociopaths. And so likely most of the people on your team can tap into some sort of empathy. And labeling people as not having good social skills or therefore not being able to have empathy is just as egregious as saying because I'm a woman, I can't code. Right? And yeah, there are people who have said that to my face, but I know that's not true. And just my business partner, Scott, he's like, I've always been told I have poor social skills. I've been told I can't connect with people. I'm like, that's bunk. That's not true. So recognizing that empathy is a skill, it's something you can learn about and it's something that you can grow. Next is adopting a growth mindset. So this is really all about the joy of learning, right? So recognizing that you're not put in one bucket or another. It's not that I'm a business person, so therefore I can't code, or I'm a developer, and so therefore I don't have to do marketing. It's, I'm less technical than the other people on my team. I'm really comfortable with HTML and CSS, but I'm trying to improve my JavaScript and Ruby skills at the moment, right? That's very different than just opting out and saying, oh, I'm non-technical. Don't talk to me about anything. Right? And the same goes for on the other side. I'm really comfortable in the code base. I'm starting to talk to business owners about what matters in their software, and I'm really interested in improving my public speaking and my blogging skills. Right? All of these things are skills, and we all have the capacity to learn them. Next is communication is just as important as code, and this is kind of what I was alluding to earlier, where leaving artifacts of your thinking creates, that's what I think the definition of a greenfield application is something where you can quickly dive in just a matter of a couple hours. You can kind of understand what the system is doing. There's a lot of good what I call communication artifacts. And to me, legacy code is code that lacks that communication artifacts, right? Michael Feathers, who's here today, he's awesome, go see him. He talks about how it's code without tests, but I implore that we should kind of take that a little bit further and think about legacy code almost like an archaeological project, where you're trying to dig around, you're trying to do some anthropology. If you first come to a code base and you're trying to figure out what's going on, you're going to look at all these different communication artifacts. So do you have intention revealing code, right? Are your variables and classes and methods, are they complete gibberish, or are they clearly defined and intention revealing? The documentation, do you understand why something was built, maybe not as elegantly as you would have chosen, and then go, oh, you know what, that makes a lot of sense. If I was in that situation, probably would make the same decision, right? So leaving trails of your thinking is really important. Calm the chaos, so this goes back to if you're mending, a calm environment and just the ability to take a deep breath and kind of walk away is important. And then the last is craftsmanship and context. So recognizing that it's sometimes getting a prototype out that's quick and dirty is the exact right and appropriate solution. And other times when the risk is higher, you really need to make sure that you're testing and you have to understand the business context before you can assign a level of craftsmanship. All right, and so if we go back to that house model, it's like there's a difference between kind of just tossing something together for something that's going to be destroyed later, or just proving out a concept and doing the model versus building the actual thing. So if you're interested in empathy, this is a great book by Dr. Brené Brown called Daring Greatly, where she dives into lots of technical aspects of it, and it really changed my mind. I would encourage you to read it. So the last thing that I think of is that executives truly don't understand the value, right? So there's no motivation for them to change procurement models because they're like, what we have is working just fine, right? So all of us know, this is really broken, but the executives who actually have the power to change the procurement policies, they don't see what the problem is. So we've got to fix that disconnect. So the first is that executives don't understand how distractions really, really impact things. So I used to go up to Scott all the time and say, hey, got a sec? And one day I basically got this as a reaction. And he was so angry. And I asked him, I was like, I was trying to be nice. Like, I'm really trying to not bother you. What happened? And he goes, I was like 9 inception layers down and you blew it. And it's going to take an hour and a half for me to get back. Right? How many people can identify with that? Okay, like pretty much the whole room. So as a marketer and somebody who hadn't done that before, because my job is context switching all day long, right? And I didn't understand how detrimental and the loss of productivity that genuinely happens. And there's lots of research to back this up. So I got curious and I said, okay, Inception, I get that. I have seen that movie. And that makes sense. So what we did was we came up with a framework to be able to then work together. So so that we could both get what we needed, right? So the way that this works is you've got, if you need to get somebody's attention, you just say inception level. And you think, why is that so different than, hey, you got a second? Well, let's think about it, right? So if I'm 9 inception layers down, I'm holding a model within a model within an idea within a model, and it's a very precarious and delicate balance, right? Andrea comes over and says, hey, Scott, you got a sec? And Scott goes, oh, crap. Does she mean a second or does she mean 20 minutes? Because she's a talker. Okay, can I stop right now? Am I a good stopping place? And the analysis that has to happen in order to come up with a yes or no answer is actually pretty complex. And so you shift your attention over to, can I give her a second? Because, and from my perspective, I was like, you could always say no, but we are problem solvers. We want to say yes, right? So there's that kind of pressure, either intrinsically or external. But that doesn't happen when all you have to do is name where you are. So if I'm 9 inception layers down and Andrea comes up again and says, hey, Scott, you got a sec? And I say inception level and he goes 7, I just back off. And so we just have an understood protocol that if somebody pings you and you're too deep down, when you resurface back up to a 0, then you reach out to whoever pinged you. And so the idea too is I think of it almost like decompression sickness, if people have ever gone scuba diving, right? If you go down way too deep, down to the bottom, and you resurface too quickly, you get really sick. And the same thing can happen with ideation. If you're way down in the bowels of the code and you've got a lot in your brain, you're holding all this information in your head, if that suddenly gets popped and you can't naturally surface its way up to its natural kind of buoyancy, if you will, then that can be really jarring. And this goes the other way too. So for me, we notice it's not just when you're focusing on technical things. For me, when I'm focusing on our strategic plan, I've got ideas within ideas within ideas within ideas, and I'm going big picture. So it works both ways, and this has been a really great framework to be able to collaborate, but at the same time preserve our autonomy and focus time. The next way to effectively talk to executives is to use metaphors. And I know that at this point you're probably checking out and saying, oh, this is such a soft skills talk. I don't want to I don't want to have to worry about this. Well, just know that metaphors, you can get just as technical about metaphors as you can about any other thing in software, right? So English is a language, right? You can get just as technical on the linguistics of this. And there are some developers like Joshua Kirievsky and Nat Price that are really kind of running with this idea. So I'll start with a story and then I'll describe to you kind of how you can build an effective metaphor. So we had a CEO, a client of ours, and she and the CIO were just not able to figure out how to work together. And basically the CEO was saying, I don't understand what the role is between my CIO and Corgi Bites, right? So we had been brought in to kind of help them because they had built a system on Grails, right? But it was very data heavy and they didn't have any users. And so we said, if you're really focused on data, you're probably going to want to use Python instead of Grails because there's a lot of libraries and it's just going to overall be a more effective thing. And so we were focusing on the transition from Grails to Python, but the CIO was focusing on the data side. So he was focusing on the data schema and preparing the data so that it would be able to plug in. We had gotten to the point where we were done with our work and she was really confused why we paused. And so trying to describe this became really frustrating. So she called me, she was frustrated. He called me and he was frustrated. And so I asked him, I said, his name's John. And so I said, John, talk to me, if you were to describe the situation to Sue, what would you do? What's a metaphor? And he goes, well, it's like a truck. I was like, yes, keep going, right? And so he was like, well, it's they had a really old truck and they decided that, yeah, they could keep that going for another 20,000 miles, but the maintenance on it was going to be so expensive that it's probably worth just buying a new truck. And so they've bought the new truck, which is exactly what you've done, but I have to create a custom bed because we're going to have so many different ways that this data is going to come in that we want to make sure that we get efficiencies there. So I'm in charge of the payload and you're in charge of the vehicle. I was like, awesome, you go tell her exactly that. And he did. And then Sue called me back, she goes, I don't know what you did, but I understand now, and we're good, and thank you for saving me money, right? So these can be really powerful things. And think about metaphors. What do we use metaphors for? We use metaphors to convey really abstract and complex information in a super quick and fast way, right? And this is what executives need. And it's not dumbing things down. It's getting things to a point where people can understand each other. And that is really powerful. So here's how you build a metaphor. George Lakoff is fantastic. He's a cognitive linguist. I pretty much follow anything he does. And so here's his and so this book, Metaphors We Live By, is basically a technical manual for how to build metaphors. So if this is something that interests you and you want to dive into the details, this is a fantastic resource. But here's the general concept. First, you ground it in a shared experience, right? So in our example before, most people have driven a car, right? So it's most people kind of have the idea of an old car and a new car. We've seen cars all around. So that's the kind of shared experience. Not everyone has experience packaging up data, right? And so if you're talking in purely technical terms to someone who has never coded before, you do not have a shared experience and you will be doomed for failure every single time. So once you have a shared experience, then you agree on a concept. So it's oh, have you ever driven a car before? Yeah, of course I've driven a car. Okay, well, it's kind of like an old, oh, okay, I see that. And it becomes almost like improv a little bit. So it becomes this banter where you're playing back and forth. And then you build the concept through supportive metaphorical expressions. So in the story, it's Corgi Bites is the truck and, the work I'm doing is the payload, right? So we're extending that metaphor and that supports it. The big difference here is that you're starting from the big picture and then drilling down to the details, which is a little different than how we approach code, right? We usually look at the details and then a pattern emerges from that. But again, this is just a skill, right? This is called associative thinking, and the more that you do it, the easier it becomes. But it's accessible, and everyone in this room can build it up. So the last thing I'll talk about is when to hire menders and when to hire makers. So this is what's called the product life cycle. And normally you have it's like a pie, it's like a bar chart, and so it starts down here with growth and maturity, but we we put this together for an Agile conference, and we were like, oh, it needs to be a circle, because everything in Agile is a circle. And, but it actually kind of works. So when we did that, we noticed that like growth and maturity are kind of on the top here, and then development and introduction are on the bottom here. And we're like, oh, there's kind of two inflection points that are, subject to breakage, if you will. So, if a company hits maturity, but then they don't develop, they'll head into decline, right? Or sorry, it starts with introduction. So if somebody introduces something to the market, but then they don't actually grow it, they're going to fade into obscurity. No one's ever going to know who they are. They can have the most beautiful and craftsmanship code base in the world, and this was the problem that Scott had when he first approached me. It's like, I have this awesome code base, I love it, and there was no market for it, right? So if you make it past growth and then into maturity, right, this is where O&M comes in. So if you don't further develop so that you can do more introduction, you end up just fading into decline. And look at this nice little line, right? So makers do really, really well in the introduction and growth. I actually mislabeled these, sorry. So introduction and growth is where makers thrive. And maturity and development is where menders thrive. And the way that you can think of it is that makers, again, prototypes, MVPs, feature building, lots of experimentation. More on the development side is bug fixes, refactoring, performance, security, scalability. All of these things are really important for building good software. One skill is not better than the other, but you need to know when to put which people on which projects. So we've got about 15-ish minutes left for questions. So there's a microphone, so they're recording this. And so just ask that if you have a question to use the microphone so that we can capture it. Yes?
Thank you. How do you at Corgi Bytes know when you have a customer? What do you do for them specifically, and when is it a success? That's my first question. My second question is, why do you think automotive technologies always come into software development? In my experience, that's been the case.
Sure. So I'll address the first one. So the way that we typically approach things is we have a technical discovery, and our standard is we do what we call a code inspection. Scott's back there working on one now, right? So we have a bunch of custom scripts that we've written to be able to analyze a code base. So it's looking at static analysis, it's looking at risk management, we're looking at licensing, we're looking at all the different things that you look at. What's your DevOps? Do you have what's your test coverage? So kind of just looking at the general health of a code base. And then from there, we write a report, and some client, it depends on what the client needs, but a lot of clients need help pitching the value of this work to a CFO. So that's where some of our experience with the communication side really comes in. So we'll write it for an executive to basically create the business value case, and we do some business value assessment. But basically say, here's about how much we would suggest spending a month. And then what we do as part of the technical discovery is we usually suggest doing 2 developers full-time for 6 weeks. And that's a good way to gauge velocity. And then at the end of that, we say, okay, here's what we discovered within those 6 weeks. Things were, our hypothesis was that it was going to be, it was going to take this many hours to complete this task. It was actually more efficient than we expected, or it was less efficient, but taking a very non-judgmental approach. And then at the end of 6 weeks, it's like, what do you want to do next? And for some clients, it's, this was perfect. This is exactly what I needed. I've got a good sense. Now I can go hire some internal resources. And we're like, that's great. We do not see ourselves as necessarily a long-term vendor. We're in there to help solve problems, right? And some clients have stayed with us for 3 or 4 years because they like us and they find it more efficient. But the way that we describe kind of a success is, so there was a client of ours who came to us and they had a product that they had spent $2 million on it with another company that was based out of India, and just they were really frustrated. There was a lot of duplication in the code. The system was just really fragile. And the question that they wanted us to answer was, should we just scrap this? Is there anything that we can retain, or is this just a sunk cost? So again, that's the hypothesis. And from there, we said, we think that if you spend $50,000, we can probably get it to a demoable state. So we did. And then at that point, they said, oh my gosh, this is great. It takes 4 minutes to load. Could you make it faster? We're like, yeah, how much do you want to spend on researching to see how much faster we can make it? And so they said, 3 months, we'll have 2 developers on it full time, because if we can make 1 sale, we can recover the cost. Then they made 2 sales, and then they were able to ramp up, right? So, and then eventually they hired a VP of engineering and built an internal team, and now we're in the process of slowly phasing it off. So that's what I think, it genuinely is taking a brownfield application that would possibly otherwise be scrapped, but there is a lot of potential business value there. And they spent way less than if they had built the whole system over again. We were able to recover specifically a lot of the business logic. So, and then can you repeat your question about the automotive industry?
I'm a developer.
Uh-huh.
Time and again, one superior boss of mine or another has said that it's like an automobile. It's like you're driving or a model view controller. And again, it hasn't just been a one instance. And I'm a little tired of it. And I just wanted to a light comment on that.
So my example of the metaphor probably annoyed you. The other metaphor that I'll probably just press to annoy you, because I use it all the time too. It's not specifically to describe the MVC, but I think that cars are really good because they're an accessible metaphor, right? And it's a good shared experience. Like, it's rare to find somebody who hasn't had an experience at least riding in a car. So I think that might be something that people go to quickly. Sports metaphors, war metaphors, like there's other kind of just natural things that you can go to. But that doesn't mean that that's what you have to. So I would encourage you to think of another way, right? And so rather than just being annoyed, what solution would you think would be better, like to improve on it? One thing that I do describe is that legacy code, the amount of effort that's described is almost like having a car that's stuck in the mud. And so you can think of Bytes or a similar company who specializes in legacy code as you're going to spend a lot of effort up front and you're not going to see a lot of movement, right? But if you spend no effort, you're guaranteed not to move, right? And it could be that you spend effort and then you say, you know what, I'm just going to leave it in the mud. It is not worth recovering this thing, right? But if you get it out of the mud and you kind of get past that inflection point, well, then you can clean it off and you're zooming down the highway again. So, that's another example of a metaphor. So, other questions?
I'm wondering if is there an in-between between Menders and makers where you're trying to innovate and feature build on existing products?
I am exactly that. Yeah, so I think that there are a lot of people, it's like an introvert-extrovert. That's the best kind of metaphor I can use to describe it, is that people either naturally really identify and say, oh my God, I have people who ask me how we like test-driven development. They're just I can't even imagine doing work that way. And then there are other people who are I can't imagine not doing work that way. And then there are people in the middle who are sometimes it's appropriate. Sometimes if I just want to bang out an idea, I just prototype it and I don't worry about it. But other times when the stakes are high, I implement it, right? So I identify kind of as both. So I really get the ideation, but at the same time, a blank page can be really intimidating. So I sometimes like having things to work from. So yeah, for sure, you can be kind of in the middle. So.
Say I'm a maker, do you find value in leaving me in that type of role that's more ideal for a maker? Or do you try to get people to kind of switch sides and kind of try to get better with the other side?
That's a good question. I think it's always good for perspective taking, right? So I think it's always a good idea to learn what it's like being in the other person's shoes, right? So as a way to build empathy. So one thing that, I don't know if Zappos still does it, but one of the things that Zappos did in the book, Delivering Happiness, their CEO, Tony Hsieh, said that everyone who started at Zappos worked on customer service. Doesn't matter what your role is. If you're a developer, if you're an attorney, whatever, you do 2 weeks in customer service because that's at the heart of everything that we do. And so everybody needs to have that experience of talking to customers on the phone, because then when you're doing your role, which is more specific, you'll have an instance of when it's valuable. So I think that it's helpful to do some kind of experimentation along those lines, but at the same time, it's like if you're not going to find joy in your work, you're not going to be happy, and you're going to be way more prone to burnout. So I would say that in the long run, it's probably better to align yourself with a role, and that could be something in the middle, it could be something on either extremes. So if you like being a maker, awesome, be a maker, right? Know what you're good at and say, these are the things that I'm best at. Bug fixes are really tough. I know a lot of times people do the rotation where it's like whoever's on customers, it's like they rotate it. And so when I say, if your team genuinely hates that, and everybody is fighting, like hire a company like ours. I mean, not trying to sell from the stage, but there are companies out there who would find joy in that experience. And so if it's bogging down your team and deflating morale, there are solutions to it. So I think it's valuable to try new things, but if you're really hating it, beyond the point of like just whenever you learn a new concept, there's the dip, right? So you're going to kind of go through a period of frustration. Everybody who's learned how to code has hit that dip, right? Like where you're just so frustrated, but then your confidence grows, and it's the same with any other skill. So, but if you truly aren't happy, then I think know what your skills are and align elsewhere. If you can't change your situation, right? So, other questions? All right, excellent. Well, we're right on time, so thank you all very much for joining us, and have a great rest of the conference.